Thank you very much all for joining us today for our final session on conflict and post-conflict studies. We have two very fascinating papers that are going to be presented in this session. Our first paper will be by Mohamad-Mehdi Berjaoui, whose paper is entitled From National Resistance to a Regional Player, The Making of Hezbollah's Foreign Policy. I will act as one discussant. We also have Nurullah Munawwar, who will be acting as another discussant on this paper, and then afterwards we'll be presenting his own paper. Muhammad, you have roughly 25 minutes. If you require any more time, that's perfectly fine. So without further ado, I'll let you begin.
Okay. Thank you. I'll be sharing my screen. Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you'll enjoy this presentation. And for those who have read my paper, you have already enjoyed it, I hope. Okay. My paper is entitled From a National Resistance to a Regional Player, The Making of Hezbollah's Foreign Policy. So the outline of my paper or my presentation will be as follows. First, I will have an introduction, which will introduce a background of the topic and of Hezbollah's history. Then I move to presenting the research questions, and then I present the aims and objectives of this paper, the theoretical framework, the literature review, and the methodology. It's worth noting that this is my PhD proposal. This is not a complete chapter nor a journal paper. Okay. In 1982, Hezbollah emerged in the aftermath of the 1982 Israeli invasion of Beirut. It's worth noting that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards played a vital role in training Hezbollah's members. Moreover, in addition to the Iranian role, Syria played a very important role, as it was the corridor that all the weapons and the personnel moved from Tehran to Beirut via Damascus. And during the Syrian presence in Lebanon, Syria supported Hezbollah politically, and it was very important for Hezbollah in covering them politically against any political offense from other players. Okay, there were always a question whether is Hezbollah going to establish an Islamic state in Lebanon similar to the Islamic state in Iran. If we go back in history, when Hezbollah was established, Hezbollah's logo and Hezbollah's flag was very similar to the flag of the Revolutionary Guards of Iran. And also in the flag and in the logo, it was mentioned الثورة الإسلامية في لبنان, which means the Islamic Revolution الثورة الإسلامية في لبنان, which means the Islamic Revolution in Lebanon, which really scared many of other Lebanese people, especially the Christians. When Hezbollah started participating in the political life of Lebanon, Hezbollah decided to send positive messages to the Lebanese people and to other parties and to other sects, and changed its logo, where it's now المقاومة الإسلامية في لبنان, which is the Islamic resistance in Lebanon, rather than the Islamic Revolution in Lebanon. Throughout the period between 1982 till 2000, Hezbollah continued to be the resistance that is resisting the Israeli occupation in Lebanon until it succeeded in liberating the south of Lebanon in May 2000. Later on, Hezbollah survived a very huge war between Lebanon and Israel in July 2006. This victory and survival in the 2006 war made Hezbollah's popularity to peak. But this didn't last so much because when the Arab uprisings and the Arab Spring started in 2010, Hezbollah paid its full support to the Tunisian uprising, to the Egyptian uprising, to the Libyan uprising, to the Bahraini uprising, to the Yemeni uprising. But when the Syrian uprising started, Hezbollah supported and backed the Syrian regime, which was very surprising to many of the observers and to many of its Arab supporters. But it wasn't a surprise for many of Hezbollah supporters in Lebanon who knows very well the very important role that the Syrian regime plays in supporting Hezbollah and in keeping Hezbollah very strong and very and they're always ready to face any Israeli war. Even one of the commentators said that he was surprised by Hezbollah's stance and suggested that Hezbollah are hypocrites. Okay, in 2013, Hezbollah announced its official engagement in the Syrian war and considered that the toppling of the Syrian regime as an existential threat. In addition, Hezbollah considered the Syrian regime to be the resistance backbone and that the resistance cannot accept breaking its back. 2 years later, after Hezbollah's intervention in Syria, Hezbollah also announced its engagement in the Iraqi war and considered ISIS control of Iraq as a threat to the whole region, where it threatens the identities of the people of the Middle East. Now I present my research questions. This thesis aims to answer the following questions. First, what are the motives of Hezbollah's foreign policy, and what role, if any, does Iran play in shaping this foreign policy? Another question, what are the consequences of this foreign policy on Hezbollah and on Lebanon? Moreover, what are the constraints that faces Hezbollah's foreign policy? In addition to the primary research questions, there are a set of secondary research questions that this thesis aims to answer. First, what role does Hezbollah play in shaping Lebanon's foreign policy, in addition to its own foreign policy? How does Hezbollah manage between their strategic goal and the fact that they are a Lebanese political party? Is Hezbollah's regional role serving the party's national agenda, or is it part of Tehran's grand geopolitical contest vis-à-vis Riyadh? How does Hezbollah's intervention fuel the sectarian rivalry regionally? Does this intervention stem from a precise geopolitical calculation, or is it a reflection of the party's identity and ideology? How does this intervention affect the party's military status vis-à-vis Israel? Did the Syrian and the Yemeni and the Iraqi wars provide Hezbollah with a strategic opportunity to claim and build a regional role? Okay. As for the aims and objectives of this research, it aims to investigate the making of Hezbollah's foreign policy, examines the transformation of Hezbollah from a national resistance to a regional player and actor. It seeks to bridge the literature on foreign policy and that of non-state actors. Also, it aims to understand and explain the role in the international politics of the Middle East, the role of non-state actors in the international politics of the Middle East. It also aims to situate the role of non-state actors and the making of their foreign policy by studying Hezbollah's foreign policy and their decision to intervene in the Syrian and Iraqi civil war. Also, it aims to explain the role of, here I mean, I have written identity, but I mean ideology, because later on I will explain why I'm going to use ideology rather than identity. This thesis explains the role of ideology in shaping Hezbollah's action. Okay. First, instead of using NSAs or non-state actor, in the thesis, I conceptualize Hezbollah as an armed political movement, because non-state actors is a very broad umbrella that includes environmental organizations, also drug cartels in Colombia, for example. It is a very broad umbrella. Also Greenpeace and other organizations. So instead, to be very specific and to explain what is Hezbollah, because using the term non-state actors, it tells us that, okay, Hezbollah is not a state, but it doesn't tell us what is Hezbollah. So I conceptualize Hezbollah as an armed political movement, and here I use this term, which was coined by Adham Sauli, who is my supervisor, in his book, where he used and conceptualized Hezbollah as an armed political movement. First, Hezbollah is armed because, as we know, that previously I have mentioned, that Hezbollah has risen during the civil war, when the Lebanese state's ability to monopolize the use of coercion was limited and was very low and was very weak. And after the civil war, which ended in 1990, Hezbollah didn't drop its weapons like other Lebanese militias, because Hezbollah was considered to be a resistance against the Israeli occupation rather than being a militia. The second term in the armed political movement, which is political, Hezbollah participates in the Lebanese political life. Currently, Hezbollah has 12 parliament members and 2 representatives in the Lebanese government. Hezbollah has built alliances with other political groups and parties from different sects, not only among the Shias. He has allies, Sunni allies. Hezbollah has also Christian allies, Druze allies. And the last category, which is Hezbollah is a movement, but here I distinguish between movement and social movement. Hezbollah is more than a social movement, because it is a recognized party that do not improvise as many social movements do. Hezbollah has a lot of planning. Moreover, Hezbollah is a member of transnational religious movements that starts in Tehran and moves and goes maybe to Yemen, to Bahrain, and passes through Baghdad, Damascus, and Lebanon. Moreover, Hezbollah is a member of the Lebanese Shia movement. Okay. One of the very important aspects and reasons that makes Hezbollah strong and able to carry on its weapons is the weakness of the Lebanese states. By definition, a weak state has weak capacity to carry out basic functions of governing a population and its territory, and lacks the ability to develop mutually constructive and reinforcing relations with the society. Building on this, Hezbollah has built up a very strong network of social organizations that supports its supporters. In addition to other Lebanese people, Hezbollah has its own military apparatus. They carry weapons, and it has its own security apparatus, which makes many observers, many observers doesn't agree that Hezbollah is a state within a state, they claim that Hezbollah is a state above the state. In addition, Hezbollah suggests that the weakness of the Lebanese state is what made Hezbollah to carry weapons to resist the Israeli occupation and to pursue its own foreign policy and to start a preemptive war and intervention in Syria to protect Lebanon from the Takfiri groups like Daesh. Okay, as for my theoretical framework, first, in my thesis, I review the major IR theories. So, common sense is to start with realism, which is a materialistic approach. It is the general term for anything that is based on power politics in international relations. Realism refers to the quest of rational unitary states to balance against power or threat in the pursuit of protecting their geopolitical interests. But here, in addition, one of the main problems of realism that it ignores or undermines ideational factors, and more importantly, it is state-centric. To a large extent, it doesn't recognize or realize the role of non-state actors, which will be problematic in my case study, as Hezbollah isn't a state, so realism and the aspects of realism doesn't fit to cover and to frame Hezbollah's case. Another major IR theory is constructivism, which takes into consideration the role of identity, where the role of identity and social factors are very important in shaping the relations between states, and identity has a very important role in shaping the actor's behavior, and identity are the basis of interests, as went claimed in 1992. But here, I raise a question: if only identity is what shapes actors' behavior, then why other actors that share with Hezbollah the same identity didn't behave in the same way? For example, Amal movement in Lebanon, both share the same identity or identities. They share the Lebanese identity, the Arab identity, the Islamic identity, and the Shia identity. And Amal movement is also an armed movement in Lebanon, but Amal didn't intervene in Syria. Then what made Hezbollah intervene in Syria? So I believe that identity isn't the answer. Also, the Sadrist movement in Iraq, that shares with Hezbollah the Shia identity and the Arab identity and the Islamic identity, also didn't intervene in Syria. So I believe that ideology is the answer. That's why in the introduction, I said I will distinguish between identity and ideology. I believe and I suggest, and this thesis claims that identity is a passive factor, while ideology is an active factor. It is the main driver for actors to behave and to move and to act. Another growing theory in IR is the securitization theory, or the Copenhagen school, where it suggests, where I will use the insights from the securitization theory to show how the Syrian uprising was framed as an existential threat for Hezbollah supporters and for Lebanon. And here I will show how sectarian references and language was evident and used increasingly. But securitization theory fails to tell us why ISIS and the Syrian uprising were framed as an existential threat, while securitization theory tells us how ISIS was framed to be a threat, but it doesn't tell us why. It answers the how question rather than answering the why question. Another theory that will be used also is the foreign policy analysis. In my thesis, I believe and I suggest that there is not a single theory can capture all the complexities of the situation and the puzzle that this thesis aims to solve. That's why this thesis will build up its own theory, building on analytic eclecticism, where this thesis aims to bridge between different IR theories, and ultimately it hopes to introduce a theory or framework that is capable of explaining foreign policies of actors other than states, whether they were NSAs, NGOs, armed political movements, etc. And it mainly aims to show how ideology and material power interact in shaping and driving actors' behavior. Going through the literature, basically I had so many literature to go over. There is the literature on Hezbollah. There are plenty of literature tackling Hezbollah's creation, identity, and ideology that covers different phases of Hezbollah's history. But there is a lack of the literature tackling Hezbollah's regional role post-2013. Well, most of the literature that talks about Hezbollah's role post-2013 tends to be very political rather than being academic work. Most of the literature that tackles Hezbollah either is written by Hezbollah supporters that keep on justifying Hezbollah's acts, or by Hezbollah's opponents that keeps on suggesting that Hezbollah is an Iranian puppet or Iranian tool or a proxy for Iran. And most of the literature is based on secondary sources rather than primary ones. And the other set of literature that I had to go over is the literature on foreign policy. And it's worth suggesting and stating that most of the definitions are state-centric, that doesn't take into consideration the foreign policy of non-state actors of armed political movements. And the literature talks about the limited role of non-state actors, and always they link the actions of non-state actors to other states. Also, another set of literature is the literature on foreign policy in the Middle East and Lebanon, where the literature suggests that the Arab uprisings opened the door for non-state actors to play a crucial role in regional politics, affect the state's foreign policy, assume their own foreign policy. Hennebisch in 2014 suggested that foreign policies of the Middle East is complicated by the incongruence between states and identities. Korani and Dessouky in 2008 suggested that Lebanon isn't capable to claim an independent foreign policy, while my thesis suggests that not only Lebanon is able to claim, also a group in Lebanon is able to claim its own foreign policy. Also, Korani and Dessouky in 2008 suggest that Lebanon became an arena for policies of other regional actors.
Mohamad, I just want to let you know you have approximately 5 minutes, but if you need 10 minutes, that's fine.
I'll finish in 5 minutes, I think. Sauli in 2014 raised the question about Lebanon's national identity, whether it is Lebanism or Arabism. Bassel Salloukh in 2008 also talked about post-war foreign policy, whether it is, and suggested that it is a pro-Arab foreign policy orientation, because he talked about the post-war, the post-civil war in 1990, where the Syrian were controlling the foreign policy of Lebanon. And that's why it was pro-Arab foreign policy oriented. Also, Stowley in 2014 suggests that in post-Syria Lebanon, each political and sectarian group adopted their own foreign policies. And Sallouk and Mikelian in 2013 suggest that Hezbollah was considered to be a tool in Iran's and Syria's foreign policies. But later on, Hezbollah, especially after the Syrian evacuated Lebanon, that Hezbollah started to making its own foreign policy. Well, the methodology that I will follow, mainly it will follow qualitative methods and will use qualitative methods. It aims to understanding of how and why Hezbollah made its own foreign policy, which is independent from the state's foreign policy. Mainly, I have already started, and I will continue, hopefully after Corona, interviewing senior Hezbollah's personnel. In addition, I will be interviewing Lebanese, Syrian, Iraqi, and Iranian politicians and journalists and political analysts. I will analyze Hezbollah's public releases, and I will analyze Hezbollah's discourse, mainly Hezbollah's leader public speeches and interviews. The constraints that I expect to be facing, and I have already faced, is the time availability of the interviewees and security and safety constraints, especially amid the coronavirus pandemic. I will be having 2 case studies, Syria and Iraq. I was at the beginning of my research, I was planning also to include the Yemeni case, but because of the lack of resources, I will only talk about Hezbollah's intervention in Syria and Iraq. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. That was a really fascinating discussion. I was very excited to hear what you would say, because I wanted to see if some of the gaps that, some of the questions I had would be filled by your presentation, and they were to a certain extent. So I was really happy with that presentation. I'm going to take about 10 to 15 minutes to offer some feedback. Nurullah will then follow me, also taking about 10 to 15 minutes to provide some feedback. Afterwards, I'll give you a little bit of time to respond directly to the comments that you would like to respond to. And then we'll open up the floor to our audience members. And the audience members can ask questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom, as well as they can raise their hands and discuss it verbally with you, or ask the question verbally. So let me begin by saying that I think this is a fascinating or a potential fascinating study of Hezbollah's role in the region and throughout the world. I think that it has significant potential, but I should note that there's a lot of difficulty with me evaluating this, since, as you noted, it's just the introduction. So there are a lot of questions that I have as to what the precise methods you'll be using will be, how you plan to aggregate this data and evaluate this data in some systematic fashion, as well as some of the theoretical sort of assumptions that you're going to be making, and how you plan to draw from past theories. I think one of the clear things that you're going to have to establish, and you can do this to a certain extent with using secondary sources, but to some degree I would like to see some sort of primary work on Hezbollah's own agency and its ability to control its foreign policy, and to what extent that is, because obviously it is going to be constrained in some fashion. So to what degree do they actually have agency? Because that you're going to have, potentially people will question the fact that Hezbollah isn't being dictated directly by Iran when it comes to foreign policy. I feel like very often people will accept some agency in terms of the tactics and strategies that are used, as well as in terms of domestic Lebanese politics. But when it comes to that foreign agenda, is it Hezbollah that's making decision, and is it not? And how can we differentiate that? How do we know when that decision is coming, from Hezbollah internally, or is due to pressure from benefactors? That's one of the reasons why I would like to see, and I didn't see it exactly in your plan, but I would like to see a robust discussion of Hezbollah's development and the development of that foreign policy, the development of that agency over that portfolio, that foreign policy portfolio. With regards to the theories that you draw from and the theories that you plan on utilizing, it's unclear how you plan to bridge them together, how to bring them together. The theories of related to securitization and some of the constructivist theories that are out there, as well as realism. And really, what you speak of is a bit more broad than realism in your paper. Really more sort of the rationalist school versus the constructivist school, as well as FPA, which really flows from the constructivist school. So I'd like to see, I'd like, if you can fill in this gap right now, that would be fantastic, where you can discuss how you plan to bring these together. Let me. Actually, I'm going to skip one of my points. I've written a lot of comments, and I'll provide them to you via email, and then I'll just go through the main ones here. On that discussion of theory and how you plan to bridge this, one good potential starting point is a book chapter written by Wenton and Fearon, really discussing this sort of idea that rationalism and constructivism are completely opposed, and they tend to not feel that they are. And I think that this is really a trend, not just in IR, but in political science in general, where you start off with people adopting a rationalist school that's very strictly materialist, and then opening up to other possibilities. You cite one important piece, discussing that with the Hafner and Burton article in IO regarding the sort of behavioral revolution in international politics. I think that's good. But yeah, I would encourage the Wendt and Fearon articles to be a starting point to think, okay, maybe people think about rationalism in the wrong way, and they think about constructivism in the wrong way, and there is some overlap between these, and I'm working within that overlap, right? And I think that you will get support from people who draw from at least recent scholars who've sort of accepted this. So yeah, I would start with the Wendt and Fearon. We'll come back to Fearon as well. One of the things that you may be up against is that you're going to try to make the argument that IR theories are applicable to Hezbollah, and that we should use them and apply them to Hezbollah, but that they simultaneously don't apply to Hezbollah. Whereas somebody might say, well, of course Hezbollah is, is really ideologically motivated. We can think of it as a sub-state actor that's a political party that's trying to push a particular agenda. It's not a state operating, in anarchy with this fear, and although with Hezbollah that would be a bad argument, but with this, the fear that's present in anarchy. So that's one potential sort of wall that you have to clear. You have to make it convincing that these theories should apply to Hezbollah, that they have agency over their foreign policy, that they operate at essentially the level of the state, but that there is a better explanation that's out there. And right now I'm kind of speaking as a behavioralist. I keep in mind that preferences and behavior are not the same thing. And I say behavioralist not in the weird sort of Orientalist way, but in that I focus on individual level behavior. I want you to think about a bit about how preferences and behavior are not the same thing, and keep that clear in your theoretical discussion. I mean, you haven't developed it, right? So this is just me warning you of a future pitfall that I've seen in other IR literature that's out there. And so so make sure that your theory is very clear about how ideology is influencing this behavior. What is that causal connection? Is it that ideology influences preferences, and this change in preferences, influence their behavior, or does ideology act as a sort of constraint on individual behavior, right? We would like to do this, but our ideology prohibits it. One other possibility is that audience costs are influencing this. Our constituency won't allow us to take a certain action that contradicts our religious prescriptions. So that's something that you have to try to deal with somewhat thoroughly, I think, in the full and final project. One of the ways that I see you potentially doing this, although it requires a little bit more historical analysis and not so much focus on interviews, which I think the interviews are fantastic, and I think that's a great idea. But one thing that you may want to try to do is engage in some kind of process tracing to at least in your discussion of other IR theories, to eliminate them as possible explanations of what's going on. And so you may want to engage in that sort of in a sort of simple process tracing to say, well, in this particular moment, a realist would expect this to happen, and a neo-institutionalist might think this would happen, but this is what happened, and so they don't jump through that hoop, using the terminology of the process tracing, and then that sets you up to then present your theory and go through those same events, or that same set of events, and say, not only do we jump through the hoop, but I've found that piece of evidence that indicates that, it clearly was the reason. So I would encourage some potential process tracing. You can use interview material for that, but you're also going to have to engage in historical analysis to do that. This isn't me saying this is something you must do, or, it's not a good thesis. No, but it is an option to consider. I would find that kind of setup very convincing. One article that does this really nicely in a setup for further analysis is the Kenneth Schultz article on looking for audience costs, where you go through that historical event in a systematic fashion, considering what theories might predict. And then going back to audience costs, I suggest strongly that you consider audience costs and how audience costs play a role in shaping the behavior of organizations, because that's another potential issue, right, that may arise, is that if I'm looking at your thesis, I may think that really it's just the constituency that constrains Hezbollah from acting a particular way, and they must sort of present this image of being ideological, because otherwise they're just another political strategic actor. So how do we differentiate that? How do we show that really they're motivated by this ideology? That's another problem that potentially comes from interviews. You're going to have to be creative with your interviews, because the people that you're going to be interviewing will be political actors, and they're going to want to present Hezbollah in a particular way, right? And they're not going to say, oh, no, we say this, but it's really, nonsense, and we do this for strategic reasons. Nobody's going to say that, or most people won't say that. So that's something that you're going to have to consider when you engage in the interviews. If you can, before you end, discuss your methodology a little bit more and how you are thinking about processing this information, what other sources you plan to use, and give a little bit of a more thorough explanation. If you don't have one yet and you're still developing it, that's fine. And I think I covered this final point. So those are my comments. I think this is a really, really fascinating discussion. I think it has, very profound implications, not just with regards to the study of the Middle East, but with and Hezbollah, but more generally, and can be something that people who study other regions of the world can draw from. For that reason, I wouldn't so much emphasize that when you discuss the IR literature, sometimes you say, the IR literature that focuses on materialist things is really, from outside of the Middle East, but inside the Middle East, maybe it's more ideational. But I think it's really more ideational everywhere. Like that, those other factors, or those, or what I might term behavioral factors, are playing a role everywhere and not just in the Middle East. And so I would move away from some of that language. But like I said, fascinating potential. This project has fascinating potential, and I look forward to seeing the final product. And now I'm done. Nurullah, if you'd like to take the floor.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you, Mohammed, for the great presentation. And of course, many thanks for the organizers for making this event finally happen during such difficult circumstances. So I'm gonna just tell you my brief comment. It's not going to take a while because actually it's really fascinating paper. I really enjoyed reading it. It addressed several theoretical issues related to the international relations and foreign policy analysis of non-state armed political movements in the conflict zones. Mohammed started his chapter with defining what foreign policy is and what role can the state play in foreign policies. Mohammed also provided us with a brief history of Hezbollah's involvement in the Syrian armed conflict since the very beginning, and how such intervention became a military one in Al-Qusayr nearby Homs. Later on, Mohammed elaborated and explained to us how Hezbollah was accused of fueling the politics of sectarianism in the Middle East, and particularly in Syria. And later he ends the introduction by highlighting how Hezbollah shifted its approach and followed the preemptive war, as he mentioned it. That was an approach that was used by Hezbollah's opponent. In the second part of the paper, Mohammed aimed to answer the questions of the research, which can be summarized in the role, motives, consequences, and the constraints that faced Hezbollah's foreign policy. In this attempt to answer the research questions, Mohammed illustrated that Hezbollah in this research will be considered as an armed political movement. In the other part of the research, Mohammed explained how the weakness of the Lebanese state and its failure in protecting the Lebanese borders has played a key role in pushing Hezbollah to pursue its foreign policy and engage with the Syrian and Iraqi conflict. During the theoretical part, Mohammed discussed the IR theories and approaches from different angles, including realism, liberalism, and constructivism. He later elaborated the gap that this research seeks to fill, which is mainly focused on how the existing literature tends to mainly study the foreign policies of states and ignores or undermines the foreign policy of APMs, as Mohammed called them. Mohammed finishes the IR theories exploration by clarifying how the securitization theory, which is one of the most difficult words I've ever learned in English so far, suggests that not only military traditional issues can be securitized, but also environmental issues and other societal issues such as climate change and refugee crisis. Here is actually coming up my first question. If you could elaborate more, how can this theory be implemented in other social circumstances? You mentioned the refugee crisis, and the climate change, and these two issues are actually from two different fields. If you can elaborate, how can we deploy this theory to explain these social changes and social issues? It would be very beneficial for the paper, and it would be beneficial also for the reader. The final part focused mainly on the foreign policy analysis, which I like the most. Mohammed discussed in this paper two parts, or two different angles: the decision-making process and the role that domestic politics can play in foreign policy. Mohammed also concluded his chapter by elaborating the role of state and actors as the two decisive factors in the foreign policy of the Middle East. So that was actually my first question. I'm not going to take much time. And I have two other questions. I will just mention them, or do you want me to write them down? Whatever you prefer. I will say them now, and in case you want me to write them down again in the Q&A, just please indicate that to me. So the second question is, would it be beneficial if you provide more comprehensive overview of the history of military interventions done by armed political movements in the Middle East? For instance, there are some other armed political movements in the Middle East who are supported by the same regional power. If we perhaps can compare them with the interventions of Hezbollah, perhaps we can understand how this foreign policy of Hezbollah has been established and then was promoted by Hezbollah by understanding the other armed political movements in other places in the Middle East. My last question is just actually, which popped up into my mind 2 days ago after hearing the news. To what extent would the verdict of Rafiq al-Hariri tribunal affect the foreign policy of Hezbollah? Do you think that will be affected, or they will make a new shift like what they did when using the preemptive approach that was used by the enemies of Hezbollah? Do you think they will use more of those approaches used by their enemies, or they will continue with a different tendency? And I will give back the floor to Ammar. I hope I didn't take much time.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are great questions. Mohamad, you can, I'll give you 5 minutes to 5 to 10 minutes to answer any questions you want to answer right now, and then we'll move on to questions from the audience. You're still muted. Mohamad, you're on mute. Oh. There we go.
Okay. Thank you very much for the valuable feedback and for the very important points that you both have raised. Some of the points I already have some answers for them. Other points which I will mention now that are still under development because I'm more or less in the midway in my research. I will start with the last question that Noor raised about Hariri's tribunal. Whether do I think will it affect Hezbollah's foreign policy? I don't think so, because I think that the accusation was very light. Everyone was expecting a stronger accusation of Hezbollah. I think everyone is fine with what happened, everyone in Lebanon. So whether the future movement or Hezbollah, I think they are both fine with what happened. So everyone can take its own part, and they are fine, and things will, and business will continue as usual. Tomorrow is a new day. That's what I think. Concerning your other question, how can we deploy the issue of the securitization theory on other social aspects? Well, I don't have a plan to, originally I don't have a plan to include or to focus more on the securitization theory in my thesis. Because it will be, I think, otherwise it will be very broad. I need to focus on how Hezbollah framed the Syrian uprising as an existential threat, rather than taking things to a very broad. But it was, I mentioned the securitization theory and how it is used in the refugee and other social aspects as an example. Just to mention how things, how things can be securitized, even if we don't think about certain aspects and certain issues as if they are a threat or a security threat, but through because one of the scholars of securitization talks about the magic of words and the magic of language, where you can use words and language in a way that in a subjective way in order to frame anything as a threat. Okay. Now concerning Dr. Ammar's comments, I don't know if I missed any of Noor's questions. If I have missed any of the questions, please just write them again. Okay.
Just to be clear before you begin, you don't have to worry about answering everything. Choose what you feel like answering, and that's fine. And some of the questions are just things for you to think about in the future.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Concerning Hezbollah's agency, actually it is now the part of work that I'm working on. And it is the literature I'm digging in and I'm reading a lot about. And I'm going to show to what extent does Hezbollah have an agency over its actions. And it was before the lockdown, I had an interview with the second guy in Hezbollah, which is Sheikh Naim Qasim. And it was one of the main points that we discussed and that I interviewed him about. As Hezbollah claims that it was Hezbollah that decided to intervene in Syria. And he goes further to claim that Hezbollah that Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah went to Tehran and talked with the supreme leader of Iran, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, and asked his religious permission. Because Hezbollah, because of Hezbollah's subscription to Wilayat al-Faqih, they need the religious permission to intervene militarily. So, what Hezbollah suggests that they had a meeting in the Shura Council, which is the highest council of Hezbollah, and they evaluated the threat and they decided that they have to intervene in Qusair and in Damascus, because if they don't intervene in Aleppo and Damascus and the other Syrian cities, they have to face the threat and to face the Takfiris in Beirut and in the south of Lebanon. So Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah went to Iran and asked the religious permission to intervene in the Syrian war. Okay. How I'm going to bridge different IR theories. I think this is one of the main struggles that I have already started to face, and I am now facing to find this bridge and to find this link between different IR theories, because till now what I have already read and what I think that I'm going to use from each IR theory a certain aspect, and but how to find this link and how to find this bridge, I think it is still it is now developing. It's not final. The picture isn't clear in my mind. So, yeah. Okay. Concerning other points, whether ideology influence preferences or is it a constraint, I think in Hezbollah's case, I think the main driver of Hezbollah's intervention in Syria is its ideology. And in this case, it wasn't a constraint, it was the main driver.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any other comments you want to make before we move to the questions? No. Okay, so we're going to open up to the audience. I believe Rishdi Al-Faouri has a comment that he wanted to make.
شكرا دكتور سامعني.
سامعا.
شكرا جزيلا على الجلسة ذات الموضوع الهام. يعني سأقدم ملاحظتين سريعتين. يعني هناك مجموعة من الملاحظات لدي على العرض، لكن سأعلق بملاحظتين فقط حتى لا أطيل، وهما مثال يعني للقول بأن هناك حاجة لمحمد بأن يتناول يعني حزب الله وسياساته الخارجية بتحليل أعتقد أن يكون أكثر تكاملا، يعني بمعنى عندما ينظر لعلاقة حزب الله بالدولة اللبنانية يجب أن ننظر إلى العلاقة من كلا الاتجاهين، وكذلك الأمر بالنسبة لتدخله في سوريا لابد أن ينظر إلى دوافع التدخل يعني بشكل أوسع وسياسات حزب الله، بالإضافة إلى الدور الإقليمي وعلاقته بإيران. بالنسبة لمسألة ضعف الدولة اللبنانية لا يكفي يعني أعتقد لمحمد أن ينظر إلى الوضع في لبنان بصفته يعني وضع موجود بشكل مستقل عن دور حزب الله في الداخل اللبناني، إنما بصفته وضع يعني ساهم به حزب الله. يعني الدولة اللبنانية ضعيفة صحيح، لكن لابد أن ننظر ما علاقة حزب الله بهذا الضعف. هل ساهم فيه مثلا ماذا تدلنا أحداث 7 أيار عندما يعني حاولت الدولة اللبنانية استعادة أمن المطار وسحبه من حزب الله وفرغت بيروت خلال ساعات، ويعني تواجد حزب الله في بيروت وسيطر عليها. يعني ماذا يخبرنا هذا عن علاقة حزب الله بالدولة اللبنانية وضعفها وحالة الضعف التي تمر بها؟ بالنسبة لتدخل حزب الله في سوريا، يعني ذكر نقطة محمد أنه تدخل لمحاربة داعش وما إلى ذلك، هذا صحيح، حارب حزب الله داعش، لكن الموضوع كان أكثر ويعني أكثر عمقا من ذلك. هناك حلف وامتداد جغرافي من إيران إلى الضاحية الجنوبية يمر بسوريا، حزب الله تدخل لأجل ذلك للحفاظ عليه وضحى بالكثير، ضحى بالحاضنة الشعبية في سوريا، ضحى بمسائل كثيرة. كما أن حزب الله تدخل منذ الربع الأخير من 2011 قبل وجود شيء يسمى داعش، وحارب فصائل محلية مسلحة واجهت الدولة أو النظام السوري آنذاك، وكان هناك قتلى من حزب الله وعناصر الله يعودون إلى الضاحية الجنوبية، وهذا كان شيء رسمي. إذا تدخل حزب الله سابق لوجود داعش، منذ المراحل البداية كان هناك تأسيس لهذا التدخل خشية من الفراغ الذي قد يحصل، خشية من النتائج التي قد تترتب على يعني الربيع السوري. العلاقة مع إيران في الختام، يعني أريد أن أقول أن مسألة الأيديولوجيا والعلاقة مع إيران لا يكفي من أقول أن دوافع أيديولوجية فقط في سياساته الخارجية يعني لنعطيها هذا الخصوصية، لأن الأيديولوجيا هو وإيران متوافقان في الأيديولوجيا. وحزب الله يعني منذ البداية، منذ تأسيس أو منذ يعني الخطاب الأول أعتقد لحسن نصر الله، أعلن أنه هذا امتداد لولاية الفقيه وإلى ما ذلك. يعني هنا نعود إلى نقطة العلاقة بالدولة اللبنانية، هل نعتبر حزب الله فاعل وطني national actor ولا فاعل ما بعد الوطني ما فوق الوطني بحكم العلاقة مع إيران؟ أعتقد هذه المسألة التي يجب أن تتوضح. يعني كيف نتعامل مع حزب الله national actor إلى حد أي حد هو national actor، وإلى حد أي حد هو national هو يعني عامل أو فاعل ما فوق وطني يتجاوز، ومن يأتي قبل إيران أم لبنان؟ يعني هذه مسألة مهمة أعتقد يعني كي نفهم حزب الله. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا على المداخلة. أو محمد إذا حبيت أنت تاخذ دقيقتين 3 ترد you may.
Yes. مشكور جدا على الملاحظات القيمة جدا. First, I have mentioned أنا ذكرت بالpresentation and in the paper I mentioned إنه حزب الله صرح وقال إنه في خطاب شهير لأمين عام حزب الله سيد حسن نصر الله، بيقول إنه سوريا هي العمود الفقري لحزب الله أو العمود الفقري للمقاومة، والمقاومة لن تسمح بكسر ظهرها. وفعلا هذا يسبق ظهور داعش. فبس موضوع داعش والموضوع التكفيري هون أنا الفكرة ب how to link it to securitization theory because عادة الرأي العام، إذا بدنا نقسم الرأي العام، في الرأي العام اللبناني، في الرأي العام العربي، وفي الرأي العام الخاص بجمهور حزب الله أو بالبيئة الحاضنة الضيقة لحزب الله. موضوع شرح تفصيل إنه مدى حيوية وجود سوريا أو النظام السوري أو بقاء النظام السوري لحزب الله كانت عملية شرحه ليست بالعمل السهل. بينما تواجد داعش أو والفظائع التي ارتكبت بسوريا وبالعراق استخدمها حزب الله بطريقة ذكية جدا لتبرير لانه على قاعده ما متت بس ما شفت مين مات، صار سهل لحزب الله يقدم روايته ويفرجي ما كان يتوقعه مسبقا، انه في حال سقط النظام السوري رح تنهار الدوله، حيصير في فراغ ما بنعرف مين بده يعبي هذا الفراغ. فوجود داعش وسيطره داعش على مناطق واسعه من سوريا ومن العراق اعطى حزب الله بالدليل الحسي وبالصوره بالفيديو الفظائع التي ممكن ان ترتكبها داعش. فذاتس واي صار كل التركيز لاحقا بالخطاب على مخاطر سيطرة داعش، بينما أنا أوافقك الرأي أنه العامل الأساسي هو الحفاظ على هذه المنظومة أو على هذا العمق الجغرافي والديس اكسس الممتد من طهران إلى الضاحية الجنوبية إلى بيروت مرورا بالعراق وبسوريا. هذا هو العامل الأساسي اللي أدى لحزب الله أنه يتدخل. أما بالنسبة لموضوع ولاية الفقيه وهل حزب الله هو فاعل وطني أو ما فوق وطني، أعتقد بالحد الأدنى بنظرة حزب الله لنفسه هو ما بيشوف في تعارض ما بين وطنيته، لأنه بالرسالة المفتوحة لحزب الله بال 1985 حزب الله عرف عن نفسه، وهي إذا بدك الوثيقة التأسيسية لحزب الله. حزب الله عرف عن نفسه بأنه هو حزب وطني، ولكن هو جزء أساسي من الأمة. هيدي الأمة يعني حزب الله قد معظم الأشخاص ممكن يكونوا واعيين لتدخل حزب الله بسوريا وبالعراق، بس الكثيرين منهم واعيين إنه حزب الله مثلا بداية التسعينات راح على البوسنة وحارب بالبوسنة، البوسنة بين مزدوجين السنية راح حارب فيها حزب الله. فحزب الله هو بيعتبر نفسه انه هو فاعل وطني، إضافة إلى أنه هو فاعل وطني هو له دور إقليمي وهو جزء من هيدي الأمة. هلا شو نظرته لهيدي الأمة وشو ركائز تشكل هيدي الأمة هو موضوع آخر. فموضوع أنه هل هو فاعل وطني ما بشوف أنا الحد الأدنى من نظرة حزب الله تتعارض مع نظرته أو بعلاقته مع ولاية الفقيه، وارتباطه وامتداده الذي يعلنه جهارا بولاية الفقيه هو ارتباط بالولي الفقيه وليس بإيران. يعني هو ارتباط فقهي عقائدي بشخص الولي الفقيه أو بفكرة ولاية الفقيه وليس بإيران. يعني لو لم تنتصر الثورة الإسلامية بإيران سنة 1979 مش لأنه في المواطنين الإيرانيين هم شيعة كان حزب الله حيكون مرتبط بإيران، فبالتالي حيكون مرتبط بالشاه بنظام الشاه. حزب الله مرتبط بفكرة ولاية الفقيه. That's why لما بلشت الحرب، وهذا اللي ذكرته قبل شوي بمقابلتي مع الشيخ نعيم قاسم نائب أمين عام حزب الله، بيذكر انه لما بلشت تتشكل فكره التدخل بسوريا حزب الله راح اجتمع مجلس شورى اللي هو بيقرر بحزب الله واخذ القرار بالمشاركه، بس بقي هنالك الغطاء الشرعي، لانه حسب هون I'm quoting الشيخ نعيم قاسم بيقول انه نحن بدنا يوم القيامه نحن رح نوقف قدام الله بدنا نجاوبه انه هيدا الدم الذي اريق ان كان من مقاومي حزب الله او مقاتلي حزب الله او من الطرف الاخر باي حق هيدا الدم. فهو هيدا الترم او التعبير اللي استخدمه انه كنا نبحث عن الاجازه الشرعيه وليس عن الموافقه الاستراتيجيه، هل هو شيء مفيد انه نحن نتدخل او لا. حزب الله كليم انه حزب الله هو اللي اثار الموضوع مع الايرانيين وهو اللي اثار الموضوع واذا بدك جذب الايرانيين الى ضروره التدخل في سوريا وليس العكس. فكان الطلب او الموافقه من الايرانيين او من اذا بدك من الولي الفقيه وليس من الايرانيين. وهون اهميه التمييز ما بين الامرين. هو الطلب الولي الفقيه وليس من الإيرانيين من الولي الفقيه بصفته المرجع ومرجع التقليد، وهي هون بنكون عم ندخل بموضوع فقهي شيعي. That's why كانت الحاجة إنه ياخذوا الإذن الشرعي أو الإجازة الشرعية. النقطة الأخيرة اللي بحب أثيرها وجاوبها موضوع weakness of the Lebanese state. بتصور إذا واحد بيرجع بعرض تاريخي، هي يعني نحن هلا بسنة 2020 بنكون عم نحتفل بين مزدوجين بمئوية تأسيس لبنان اللي هي تأسست بال 1920. هنالك العديد من التشابترز والليترشر والكتب اللي انكتبت عن كيف هيدي الدولة ركبت كي تكون ضعيفة. فحزب الله هو اجى ردة فعل على ضعف هيدي الدولة. فحزب الله لما تأسس بال 1982 حل بديل عن ضعف هيدي الدولة اللي كانت أصلاً بخضام حرب أهلية. فهل هو حزب الله إنه way or another بيساهم باستمرارية ضعف هيدي الدولة أو لا؟ هو قد يكون له محل من النقاش أكيد، ولكن من وجهة نظر حزب الله
Hi, Mohammed. I don't know if you're hearing me, but the internet is starting to cause a bit of the exit. All right. So I believe we may have lost Mohammed. He was having some internet issues. But he'll be back in a second. I wanted to see if there were any other questions that people wanted to raise, so we can take an order right now so that when he returns, we have questions lined up. Did anybody want to ask any questions? Oh, Mohammed, you're back?
Yes.
Okay. If you could repeat your answer to the third part, because you were cutting out for most of that.
ما بعرف شو آخر شيء سمعتوه. أنا كنت عم بحكي عن موضوع ضعف الدولة اللبنانية ووذر حزب الله هو مساهم باستمرارية ضعف هيدي الدولة. بتصور معظم هيدا النقاش بيصير هو مين بيسبق البيضة أو الدجاجة. بس المؤكد انه ضعف الدوله اللبنانيه هو تاريخي ويسبق تاريخ تاسيس حزب الله. حزب الله تاسس بال 1982 بينما الدوله انحلت وضعفت وتفككت بال 1975 عندما بدات الحرب الاهليه في لبنان. واستمر هيدا الضعف نتيجه الكثير من العوامل. قد يكون وجود حزب الله المسلح، قد يكون له هون قد يفتح نافذه للنقاش. قد يكون حزب الله له دور أو حمل حزب الله للسلاح له دور في استمرارية هيدا الضعف تبع الدولة اللبنانية. ولكن أعتقد إنه حزب الله من وجهة نظره هو ليس مستعد الآن أن يلقي بالسلاح على أمل أن تصبح الدولة قوية، لأنه حزب الله won't take this risk. لأنه meanwhile during this transition period حزب الله cannot guarantee إنه ما يصير في اعتداء إسرائيلي عليه، ما يصير في موجة تكفيرية بتهاجمه إلى آخره. فإلى أي مدى حزب الله هو السبب إلى أي مدى حزب الله هو السبب باستمرارية ضعف الدولة اللبنانية قد يكون هنالك محل النقاش. ولكن الأكيد وهنالك الكثير من الارتيكلز والبوكس اللي انكتبت عن الموضوع اللي تعمل عرض واستعراض تاريخي لضعف الدولة منذ تأسيسها بال 1920. فالضعف الدولة اللبنانية وتفكك الدولة اللبنانية هو سابق لوجود حزب الله أساساً واستمر إلى فترة لاحقة.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that's in the Q&A. You can see it posted from Yazid, but to give the audience members a sort of shortened description of the questions, there are two of them. The first question is that you presented some IR theories and saying, and you've basically said that, you know, we need something else to explain Hezbollah's foreign policy. So in what ways have these theories failed to actually be appropriately fitted to the Hezbollah policy? Are they poor predictors of Hezbollah's foreign policy? And have you thought of neo-Gramscian theory, for instance, that tries to reconcile material and ideational criteria? And then the second question relates to the examination of the literature on Hezbollah and its foreign policy, and what gap exists that you're filling with your thesis. So if you'd like to answer that question, I'll give you a few minutes. Mohamad, can you hear me? It seems like your screen is frozen and I can't hear you. Okay, I think you're back.
Yes.
Sanani? All right. Okay, I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, I need to read it because I wasn't hearing you. Okay, concerning the first question, I think that I have made it clear in my in the paper that I don't know if Yazid have read the paper or he just listened to the presentation, because in the paper I said why realism, for example, isn't sufficient or doesn't explain Hezbollah, the motives of Hezbollah's theory. Because, for example, one of the questions that I raised in the paper is why does Hezbollah feels that for example, an American intervention in Syria is a threat, while a Russian intervention in Syria isn't a threat? So realism for me doesn't explain the situation, and also because realism doesn't take into consideration the role of non-state actors. It is state-centric, and I think it assumes directly that Hezbollah doesn't have any agency over its actions, or any non-state actor, not necessarily Hezbollah. Any non-state actor doesn't have any agency over its actions. It's always linked to other states. So if I want to rely only on realism, then directly I will be accepting the claim that Hezbollah is a proxy or a tool for Iran, which in my research I'm going to prove and to show how Hezbollah isn't a proxy for Iran. Hezbollah is an ally for Iran. Hezbollah is ideologically linked to Iran, but isn't a proxy or a tool for Iran. And this concerning, for example, realism. And concerning constructivism, I showed, even in the presentation, I said, for example, because constructivism over focuses on the role of identity. I showed why if identity is the answer or the motive and the driver for Hezbollah, then why other groups and movements that share the same identity like Hezbollah, why didn't they intervene militarily in Syria or in Iraq? And I gave the example of Amal movement or Harakat Amal. So I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you very much, Muhammad. Did you want to answer the second question?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I agree with Yazid that because this was the very old proposal, I didn't update it, and it doesn't show the puzzle in a good way. Yeah, I totally agree. Yes, the puzzle that I think I should work more on it and I should explain it more. Yes, I totally agree with him.
So in some ways, it's an issue of your initial puzzle. In some ways, it's an issue of case selection itself. If we consider this a broader study of armed political movements, so I understand it not being directly in. But do you have an answer for how this fits as one of your puzzles? And then we'll have one other question.
Yes. Yeah, I think the puzzle that I have to focus on. Is why actors that share the same identity or بين مزدوجين have the same profile as Hezbollah didn't act in the same way as Hezbollah. For example, the Sadrist movement or Jaysh al-Mahdi in Iraq or the Amal movement. So what made Hezbollah intervene in Syria? And while maybe I have to make it more a comparative, and maybe also Noor suggested this, to compare it with other armed political movements in the Middle East, maybe.
That's a possibility. The problem that you have is it's hard to compare it to any particular movement. But so it's all of these issues tend to be difficult. This is not, that just means that you're entering into interesting ground. But it's hard to compare Hezbollah to Amal for a number of reasons, because they're so different. Not just they're similar in one dimension, but so different in other ways. Okay, we have another question from Ali Rida related to your engagement with the literature regarding Hezbollah stance with regards to Israel, and if you have engaged, you didn't directly engage that literature in our discussion, but do you engage with that literature, and can you provide a discussion of that?
Yeah, actually,
or why you didn't if you didn't?
Yeah, I didn't, and since he wrote in Arabic, I'll answer in Arabic. أنا ما كتير حكيت عن دور أو موقف حزب الله من الصراع مع إسرائيل ومحورية هيدا الصراع مع إسرائيل وتأثيره على قراره بالتدخل، لأنه لسببين. أول شيء literature, there is a lot of literature on صراع حزب الله مع إسرائيل. فأعتقد معظم الأمور كتبت عن هذا الموضوع. ثانياً تدخل حزب الله أو الكليم أو الفكرة الأساسية من تدخل حزب الله في سوريا حسب ما بيقول حزب الله هي حماية ظهر المقاومة المعنية في الصراع مع إسرائيل. That's why عندما سقط الكثير من الشهداء لحزب الله في سوريا خلال تشييعهم كان يقول على طريق القدس. فبالنسبة لحزب الله كل الأمور تؤدي أو هي في خدمة صراعه مع إسرائيل. هل هو مقنع للآخرين؟ هذا بحث وشأن آخر.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question from Dr. Mohamad Hamshi.
السلام عليكم. شكرا جزيلا دكتور عمار، شكرا محمد على الورقة. سأقدم تعقيبا سريعا باللغة العربية فيما يتعلق بالعلاقة بين حزب الله وإيران. أعتقد أن مفهوم الهوية مهم جدا في تحليل هذه العلاقة، وأنت استعنت بالمقاربة البنائية. الهوية تعرف في العلاقات الدولية بسؤال كيف يعرف الفاعل نفسه، كيف ينظر إلى نفسه، وهذا ما يحدد مصالحه بطبيعة الحال إذا استندنا إلى أطروحات ألكسندر ونت. المشكلة في الهويات الطائفية أنها لا تحدد وطنيا، وإنما تحدد بشكل عابر للحدود. لذلك حزب الله عندما يعرف نفسه طائفيا فهو لا يفكر فقط في شيعة لبنان، وإنما يفكر في الشيعة الموجودين في المنطقة ككل، وأنتم من المنطقة وأدرى بذلك. وهذا يرتبط كذلك بحالة البحرين. أتذكر إحدى الأوراق التي قدمت في مؤتمر نظمه المركز قبل سنوات حول المسألة الطائفية في البحر الميت. كان أحد المداخلين قد حاجج بالتالي، قال بأن الشيعة في البحرين لا يعرفون نفسهم محليا، لأنهم إذا عرفوا نفسهم محليا سيعتبرون أنفسهم أغلبية، لكنهم يعرفون أنفسهم إقليميا، ومن ثم يعتبرون نفسهم أقلية. العفو، محليا هم أغلبية، لكن إقليميا هم أقلية، وبالتالي فهم في حاجة إلى من سيزودهم بالحماية. دعوني أستخدم هذه المفردة. وفي كلتا الحالتين، في حالة البحرين وفي حالة حزب الله، ليس ثمة من هو أفضل من إيران لتزويدهم بهذه الحماية. وشكرا.
Thank you, Dr. Mohamad, this will be our final question. So take as much time as you need, and then we'll end our session.
لا عذرا، أنا في لحظات فقدت الكونكشن. I think I missed the question. يعني سمعت العرض وسمعت التعريف، بس I missed the question. السؤال بالضبط شو كان بالضبط؟
لا ما كان في سؤال محمد، كان تعقيب فقط. الهوية عندما تعرف طائفيا، الفاعل عندما يحدد هويته طائفيا لا يحددها وطنيا، انما يحددها بشكل عابر transnationally، بشكل عابر للحدود فقط. كان
تعقيبا على تعقيبك، بس حزب الله بالتعريف إذا عم نركن إلى تعريفه لذاته لنفسه، هو لم يعرف نفسه إن كان بال 1985 بوثيقته الأولى، بوثيقته التأسيسية والتي سميت بالرسالة المفتوحة، لم يعرف نفسه طائفيا، اعتبر نفسه جزء من الأمة الإسلامية وليس الأمة الشيعية. وحتى بال 2009 لما عمل أبديت لوثيقته سماها الوثيقة السياسية، كمان أيضا لم يعرف عن نفسه بالانتماء المذهبي أو الطائفي. هو لا ينكر أن انتماءه الطائفي، ولكن لم يحصر هويته That's why in my paper بالورقة I mentioned that identities may overlap. قد يكون عنده الهوية الوطنية اللي هي الهوية اللبنانية في حالة حزب الله، وهو عنده الهوية العربية، ولكن عنده الهوية الإسلامية أيضاً. That's why بالنسبة له هويته العربية لا تلغي هويته الوطنية أو هويته الإسلامية أو ارتباطه العقائدي بولاية الفقيه لا يتناقض مع انتمائه الوطني أو هويته الوطنية.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohamad, for the fascinating presentation. We will be back at 4:40, where Nurullah Munawwad is going to present his paper, and you two will be reversing roles. Mohamad will be commenting on it. So I look forward to seeing you all back here at 4:40.